She didn't scream. That's the part that still haunts me when I close my eyes and try to reconstruct that night, the fact that Mara didn't scream. She whispered. Her hand found my shoulder in the dark, and she pressed down with a firmness I'd never felt from her before, like she was trying to anchor me to the bed while simultaneously pulling me out of it. Daniel. Just my name. 2 syllables delivered with the weight of a verdict. I'd been dreaming about the lake house we'd rented the previous summer. The smell of pine and cold water, our daughter Pia chasing fireflies across a lawn that sloped toward the shore. I came out of that dream fast. The way you surface from deep water, lungs tight, world suddenly sharp and unwelcoming. The bedroom was dark except for the thin blue light bleeding under the curtain from the street lamp outside. Mara was already dressed, not in pajamas, in jeans, her heavy canvas jacket, her hiking boots laced to the top. That's when I understood that something was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with a bad dream or a noise downstairs. "Pack the car," she said. "Everything you think we need. Do it quietly." "Mara, what now?" She was already moving toward the hallway. Her voice hadn't risen above a murmur, but there was an architecture to her calm that scared me more than panic would have. Mara worked emergency dispatch for 9 years. She'd heard every kind of crisis compressed into a phone call. When she used that voice controlled, stripped down, operational, it meant she was managing something that had no good outcome, only manageable ones. I got up without asking another question. Pia was 7. She slept in the room at the end of the hall with a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon that threw pale gold across the ceiling. I went to her first. I stood in the doorway and watched her breathe for exactly 3 seconds. I counted because I needed something to count. And then I went to the closet and pulled out the go bag we'd assembled 2 years prior, after a wildfire threat that never materialized. Mara had insisted on it. I thought she was catastrophizing. I was wrong about that, as it turned out. I was wrong about a lot of things regarding Mara's instincts. While I loaded the bag, Mara was in the kitchen. I could hear her opening cabinets, the soft mechanical click of the pantry door, the crinkle of packaging. I went to Pia's room, gathered her blanket and the small stuffed rabbit she called Benny, and left them at the foot of her bed without waking her. Not yet. We were still in the preparation phase. The street outside was wrong. I noticed it when I carried the first load to the car, a noise that sat beneath the ordinary sounds of a sleeping neighborhood. Not an alarm, not a siren. Those sirens would come later. Something lower and more diffuse, like a vibration more felt than heard. Like the city was running a fever it hadn't disclosed yet. Our neighbor's dog, a German shepherd named Colt, who never barked at anything, was pressed against the fence at the back of their yard, completely silent, staring toward the eastern end of the block with an intensity that turned my stomach cold. I looked where Colt was looking. 3 blocks down, at the intersection where Meridian crossed Halbert, a man was standing in the middle of the road, just standing, not walking, not waiting to cross. The streetlight above him buzzed with that particular yellow stutter that happens before a bulb dies, and in those intervals of light, I could see him clearly enough. His head was down, his arms were at his sides. He was swaying not dramatically, not the theatrical stagger of fiction, but in small, almost imperceptible oscillations, like a tree in a wind nobody else could feel. Even from that distance, I registered something wrong in the geometry of how he was holding his body. His neck was tilted at an angle that suggested complete muscular surrender. Then he turned toward me. I don't know if he heard me. I don't know if he saw me. But he turned, or nascent, and that was the last ordinary moment I would ever have. I went back inside without looking away from him, which meant I walked backward up the porch steps and nearly missed the top one. My hand found the door frame and I steadied myself. Pulled the door shut, locked it. The deadbolt. Then the chain. My hands were doing the things hands do when the brain is still catching up to a fact it isn't ready to process. Mara was in the hallway when I turned around. She had Pia in her arms. She'd gotten our daughter up and dressed without me hearing, which told me she'd been awake for longer than this conversation. Pia was groggy and confused, but not crying, because children absorb the emotional key of their parents in moments like this. And Mara was broadcasting something that registered as serious without registering as terrifying. Pia held Benny against her chest and looked at me with eyes that were still half filled with sleep. "There's someone in the street," I said. "I know." Mara handed Pia to me. "There are more down by the Rosenberg complex. I could hear them when I was on the back porch about an hour ago." She picked up 2 of the bags from the floor and moved to the front door. "There's a frequency alert on the emergency band. They're not calling it what it is, but I've been listening long enough to read between what they're saying." "What are they saying?" "They're telling people in sectors 4 through 7 to shelter in place. They stopped saying why 20 minutes ago." She met my eyes. "When they stop explaining, Daniel, it means they've lost control of the explanation." That sentence has lived inside me every day since. When they stop explaining, it means they've lost control of the explanation. That was Mara at her most essential, a woman who had spent a decade listening to human beings in the worst moments of their lives, and had learned to decode institutional language the way a musician hears a wrong note in a chord that sounds almost right to everyone else. We were in Sector 5. I carried Pia and my bag to the car. Mara made 2 more trips, moving with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this in her head many times, possibly for years. Possibly in those quiet hours after a shift when she couldn't sleep and I thought she was just watching television. The car was a 2019 Subaru Forester with a 3rd-row cargo area we'd converted for camping. We loaded it without turning on the house lights, without speaking above a murmur. Our neighbor, Ethan Cho, was on his porch by the time we were finishing. He was in his bathrobe, phone in hand, looking at the same eastern intersection I'd been watching. He was 43, taught high school physics, and was one of those people who had a fact for every situation. When he saw us loading the car, he crossed the small strip of yard between our properties. "You leaving?" he said. "Yes," Mara said. "The news isn't saying anything." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He looked at the intersection. The man I'd seen was no longer standing there. I didn't know if that was better or worse. "Where will you go?" Mara looked at me. We hadn't discussed a destination yet, only departure. That was the order of priority she'd established without saying it first, the leaving, then the going somewhere. "North," I said, because north was away from the city's industrial quarter, away from the Rosenberg complex, away from whatever was making Colt stand motionless at the fence. "Can I?" Ethan started. A sound rose from the eastern end of the block that stopped all 3 of us. It wasn't a scream exactly, because it contained no breath the way a scream does. It was a sound produced without apparent effort, without the architecture of intention, a pure tonal expression of something that had moved beyond individual suffering into something collective and directionless. It came from more than one source. It came from several, close together, and it was moving. "Get your family," Mara told Ethan. "You have 4 minutes." He ran. I strapped Pia into her seat. She was fully awake now, her eyes serious and round. Benny pressed hard against her sternum. "Daddy," she said. "I'm here," I said. "I'm right here." Ethan came back in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. I know because I was watching the clock on the dashboard with a focus that had compressed the rest of the world to numbers. He had his wife, Nora, in her winter coat thrown over pajamas, and their teenage son, Marcus, who was 16 and carrying a backpack and a baseball bat, with the grim practicality of a boy who had probably gamed enough scenarios to understand that preparation was not the same as paranoia. They piled into Ethan's Civic without ceremony. We pulled out together, Mara driving, me in the passenger seat with a road atlas open across my knees. She'd said no phone navigation, no cellular routing, in case the network went down or was being used to control information flow. I thought that was extreme until I tried to load the mapping app and found the loading circle spinning without end. The satellite somewhere in the sky above us having already moved on to more urgent business. The neighborhood was waking. Not all of it and not with any coordination, but lights were coming on in windows. And twice we passed people standing in driveways, looking toward the glow that was building on the southeastern horizon, a glow that was the wrong color for dawn. Too orange, too low, too restless in the way it moved. We didn't stop to explain anything to the people in the driveways. That's a choice I've carried the weight of, and I won't pretend it was easy. But Mara made it without hesitation, and I deferred to her judgment in that moment, the way I had learned to defer to it over 11 years of marriage. We were 2 blocks from the on-ramp to Route 9 North when we saw the first cluster of them. They were moving out from between 2 apartment buildings on Kelsey Street, 4 individuals. And the word individuals feels inadequate and yet is the only honest term for what they still were at that point. People in a condition that had removed them from voluntary participation in the world. 3 of them were moving in that particular uncoordinated way I'd seen in the man at the intersection. The 4th was different. The 4th was running. Not toward us, not yet. Laterally, across Kelsey, toward something on the far sidewalk that I couldn't identify in the dark. But the fact of the running altered everything. I'd been holding on to a version of this that was slow, manageable, the measured collapse of something that could be navigated around at ordinary human speed. The running erased that. "Don't stop," Mara said, though I hadn't suggested it. She took the on-ramp at a speed that put my hand against the door. And Pia made a small, involuntary sound in the back seat. And then we were on Route 9, and the city was on our right side. And from that elevation, the highway lifted slightly above the neighborhoods here. A long concrete ridge running north, we could see it. The southeastern quarter of the city was lit from within. Not burning in the sense of buildings fully involved with fire, but lit pockets of orange, and the particular blue-white of police or emergency lighting strobing across rooftops. And all of it connected by movement, by the perception of something systemic occurring across an urban grid that had, until very recently, been a city of 420,000 people going about the measurable rhythms of ordinary life. Mara's city. The city where she'd grown up, where her mother still lived in a second-floor apartment on Decatur Avenue, where she'd gone to school and met me at a mutual friend's birthday party and had said, the first time we spoke, that she thought I was wrong about something I'd said, which was possibly the most accurate prediction of our entire relationship. Her hands were at 10 and 2 on the wheel. Her jaw was set. I knew she was thinking about her mother, because I was thinking about her mother. Because there are things you do not say out loud at certain moments, because the speaking of them removes the last manageable distance between you and the thing you cannot fix. Behind us, Ethan's headlights held steady. Route 9 to the Valley Bridge, I said. Then County Roads North, Mara. I know, she said. I know. We made it 17 miles before we hit the first stoppage. It wasn't an accident, not in the mechanical sense. It was a decision someone ahead of us had made to stop their vehicle in the left lane of a 2-lane highway and abandon it, which created a compression that rippled backward through the cars that followed, each one braking and then trying to navigate around. And in the dark and the confusion, some of them had made the situation worse by pulling into the median. And what had been a flowing highway became, in the space of about a quarter mile, a static field of vehicles with nowhere to go. Mara slowed. I could see her scanning the shoulder, the tree line on the right, the median on the left, running calculations. She had a spatial intelligence about roads and traffic that I'd always attributed to her dispatch work. The constant mental mapping of where resources were relative to emergencies. "Shoulder," she said. "It's not legal." She looked at me. "Right," I said. "Shoulder." She moved us onto the breakdown lane, and we moved at a slow crawl past the stopped cars. Faces at windows. A woman with both hands on her steering wheel staring straight ahead as though forward motion was a matter of will. A man on his phone, his voice audible through his closed window in a pitch that conveyed the particular anguish of someone being unable to reach someone they love. Children in back seats, animals. One car had a cage in the back containing 2 cats who sat facing each other with the resigned stillness of creatures who had always understood that the future was not theirs to control. Ethan followed us on the shoulder. I could see him in the side mirror, Marcus's face in the passenger window, watching. We passed the source of the stoppage, a luxury SUV sitting empty across the left lane, driver's door open, interior light on. A woman's handbag visible on the passenger seat with its contents half spilled. No sign of the driver, no explanation available. We went around it, and the highway ahead was clear, and Mara accelerated back to speed. And I noticed that my left hand had been pressed flat against the dashboard without my being aware of it, as though I could slow us down by resistance. Pia slept, or something close to sleep, her head against the window. Benny held loosely in the crook of her elbow. Children have an extraordinary capacity for withdrawing from unbearable circumstances into rest. I've thought about that a great deal since. It might be the most efficient survival adaptation our species has. Ethan's voice came on the walkie-talkie, another of Mara's preparations. A pair of inexpensive but effective units charged and stored in the go-bag. "Are you seeing the radio? AM 1120. I tuned. The emergency broadcast signal had replaced the normal programming on every band I cycled through. But 1120 had a human voice beneath it, not the automated alert, but an actual person reading from what sounded like a prepared statement, in a voice doing its best to remain authoritative while clearly managing its own decomposition. The words were institutional, the language of official response in its middle phase, past denial but not yet arrived at honest disclosure. Affected individuals, containment protocol, citizens are advised. Mara listened without commenting. Then the voice stopped. The automated signal took over. It ran for 45 seconds. Then the channel went to static. "That's the Milford relay," Mara said. "That tower covers the entire northeastern grid. If it's down..." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. If the Milford relay was down, it meant the infrastructure maintenance apparatus, the people whose job it was to keep the relay running, had either been overwhelmed or had made the same calculation we had. The one that said being somewhere else was more valuable than being at your post. The Valley Bridge came up on the right, its green reflective sign catching our headlights. Beyond the bridge, the county roads spread north into low hills and farmland, and small towns with names that suggested quieter centuries. I looked back at the city one more time. By sunrise, it would be gone, not destroyed, not empty, but unreachable, which amounts to the same thing. We took the bridge. The county roads were dark in a way that felt specific, as though the darkness had been there before the roads and would remain after them. The kind of rural dark that a person who grew up urban carries with them as a mild, theoretical knowledge that it exists, that it is different until the first time they move through it with urgency, and find that it has weight and texture and its own internal logic. Our headlights created a moving pocket of visibility 40 feet deep. Beyond that, the corn on the left and the tree line on the right were a single, undifferentiated mass. I navigated from the atlas, reading mileage markers and intersection names aloud. Mara drove. Ethan and his family held position 2 car lengths behind, the walkie-talkie going quiet now, as though all of us had entered a state that required the conservation of words. We'd been on the county roads for about 30 minutes when Marcus's voice came through on the walkie. He'd apparently claimed the unit from his father. He was 16 but spoke with the compressed precision of someone older, choosing his words the way you choose footing on bad terrain. There's a light up ahead on the left, about half a mile. I looked. He was right. A stationary light at ground level, the yellow of a lantern or a lamp running on propane. Farm, Mara said. Or someone who left early enough and stopped, I said. Either way, we're not stopping. But as we came abreast of it, I could see more. A long gravel driveway, a barn with its doors open, a farmhouse with several windows lit. And standing at the end of the driveway, deliberately positioned to be visible, a woman. 50s, substantial, wearing a work coat, holding the lantern at shoulder height. Beside her, a man about the same age with a flashlight. And behind them, partially visible in the barn's open mouth, 2 more figures. The woman raised her free hand in a gesture that was neither threatening nor desperate. It was the raised hand of someone with something to offer. Mara slowed. Mara, I said. I see her. She slowed further, rolled down the window. The night air was cold and carried the smell of turned soil and something else underneath it that I couldn't identify. The woman walked to the car, but stopped at the edge of the road, respecting a distance. Heading north? She said. Yes, Mara said. Route 11 bridge is out. Not structurally, they've blocked it. State police set up a checkpoint about 2 hours ago and then abandoned it. There's vehicles stacked up there and it's become a problem. She said the last word in a way that communicated its full scope without elaborating. You want to get north? You take Emery Road 2 miles ahead on your right. Follow it to the old grain depot, left on County Road 7. Adds 12 miles, but it's clear. I sent my sons that way 90 minutes ago. Why are you still here? Mara asked. The woman looked at the farmhouse without sentimentality. Because someone has to be. She lowered the lantern slightly. You got children? 1, Mara said. 7. Take Emery Road. She stepped back from the car. There's a church in Millhaven, White Clapboard, St. Augustine's. Pastor there is organizing. He has a radio. If you get separated from your people, that's where to go. Mara thanked her. The woman nodded and walked back up the driveway without looking back. I relayed the route information to Ethan on the walkie, and he acknowledged it. And we drove in silence for a moment that felt too large to fill with language. She could have left, I said. She made a choice, Mara said. People are doing that tonight. All kinds of choices. She glanced in the rear view at Pia, still folded into something close to sleep. We made ours. Emery Road was exactly where the woman had said. The gravel was loose, and the Subaru suspension worked hard over it. But we moved. And movement was the only currency that mattered now. I kept the atlas open. I kept talking to Mara, even when I didn't have information to give her. Because silence, in that kind of dark, does things to a person's resolve that words, even ordinary words, can counteract. We drove. The city, somewhere behind us, continued its unannounced transformation. County Road 7 delivered us to the outskirts of a town called Hartwell, just before 4:30 in the morning. Hartwell had a gas station, a diner, a grain elevator, and a cluster of houses arranged around a central intersection with a blinking amber light. The gas station was open in the specific way of a place whose owner had shown up out of habit and wasn't sure what to do next. Fluorescent lights on. The price sign unchanged from yesterday. A man in his 60s behind the counter watching a television that was cycling through the same emergency broadcast message on a loop. We pulled in. Mara topped off the tank while I went inside. The man behind the counter looked at me with the expression of someone who has been hoping for information and has recently accepted that none is forthcoming. His name tag said Gerald. He had a thermos of coffee on the counter and offered me some before I could ask. "How bad is it?" he said. "I don't know exactly," I said, which was the most honest answer available. "My daughter's in the city, north side." I thought about the glow we'd seen from the elevated highway, the way it had covered the southeastern, and then, as we'd departed, begun reaching toward the central districts. North side was central. "Try the church in Millhaven," I said. "St. Augustine's. We were told there's someone there with a radio and a plan." He wrote it down on a yellow notepad with the seriousness of a man receiving medical instructions. Ethan came in while I was there, Marcus behind him. Nora stayed in the car with Pia, which Mara had arranged with a look and a nod that I'd observed through the gas station window, and felt grateful for. Ethan's face in the fluorescent light was the face of a man who had spent his entire adult life building a structure of rational predictability around himself, and was now watching it lose integrity from multiple points simultaneously. He was holding up, but holding up requires effort, and effort has a budget. "Gerald says the highway north of here is clear," I told Ethan, "but he's been hearing things from people coming through about Route 31. Apparently, it's being used for eastbound movement." "Military?" Marcus said. He'd set the baseball bat against the counter with the ease of a boy who had decided it was simply a tool now, like a wrench or a flashlight. "He doesn't know." I looked at the television. The emergency broadcast had shifted. There was footage now, aerial footage shot from a news helicopter. And the footage was of the city, our city. And from above, it looked like a living thing in a state of cell division. Movement, fracturing into movement. Patterns that made no sense from ground level resolving from altitude into something even more disturbing because it had a shape, a direction, a momentum that suggested it was going somewhere. Gerald muted the television. He did it gently, the way you mute something you want to stop but cannot look away from. "I'm going to close up," he said. "Drive to my sister's place in Carver County." He looked at the notepad with the church address on it. "After I try Millhaven." We left him to his decisions. Outside, the sky to the east was beginning its first gray concession toward dawn, not light yet, I'll say, but the absence of the deepest dark. That liminal hour where the night loses its authority, but the day hasn't yet assumed it. In that gray interval, standing at the gas station, I could hear what I thought at first was wind. It wasn't wind. It was a distributed human sound, very far away, carried across the flat farmland with the acoustic clarity of cold air. It was the sound the city was making now. Mara was at the driver's door. She looked east, listening. Pia was awake in the back seat, watching through the window. And Mara kept her profile deliberately neutral, not performing calm, but inhabiting it. Because Pia was watching and reading and calibrating. I got in. We drove north. Marcus's voice came on the walkie, quiet and factual. For what it's worth, Mr. Mercer, my phone GPS still has signal. 1 bar, if we lose the Atlas route. Keep it charged, I said. Keep it ready. Already on it, he said. We found the church in Millhaven at 5:20. St. Augustine's was exactly what the woman had described, white clapboard. A modest steeple, a gravel parking lot that had accumulated 12 cars and 1 pickup truck with a generator mounted in the bed. The generator was running, and extension cords ran from it through a side door propped open with a cinder block. People were gathered around a folding table under a canvas awning beside the building. Someone had started a fire in a metal drum, and people stood near it, not for warmth, necessarily, but for the ancient psychological reason that fire provides the evidence of a center, a here. The pastor was a compact man named Reverend Tillman, early 60s, who had apparently been awake since 2 in the morning and showed it in the way a person shows effort rather than exhaustion, alert, purposeful, using his energy carefully. He had a shortwave radio on the folding table and a handwritten log of what he'd received on it, times and frequencies noted in a neat column. He shook Mara's hand when we introduced ourselves, then mine, and his handshake was the kind that communicates information, steady, present, not performing anything. There were 23 people at the church already. Families from town, people passing through, and 3 men who'd come in from a farm operation 12 miles east and were making the case, loudly, for turning the church into a defended position. Their names were brothers Dale, Roy, and Carl Spender, and they were the kind of men who had been waiting for a situation that matched their particular skill set. Dale, the eldest, was doing most of the talking. He was arguing that the bridge we'd navigated around was a natural choke point, and that establishing a perimeter at that choke point with the right resources would give any defensive position in a Millhaven a meaningful margin. Mara listened to him for about 90 seconds before she said, "How long do you plan to hold a perimeter?" Dale looked at her with the expression men sometimes give women who speak in tactical settings. "As long as necessary," he said. "Defined against what threshold? When do you decide it's held long enough and you need to move?" "We don't move. That's the point." "The point of any perimeter," she said, "is to give the people inside it time to do something. If the thing they're doing is just existing inside a perimeter, the perimeter isn't a strategy. It's a comfort object." The fire crackled. Dale stared at her. Roy and Carl exchanged a look that was not entirely unfriendly. They recognized something, possibly, in the directness of the challenge. "My wife was emergency dispatch," I said. Not as apology, but as context. "What's your idea, then?" Dale said to Mara. "I don't have one yet," she said. "I've been driving for 2 hours, and I want to look at Reverend Tillman's radio log before I have an idea." She paused. "But I know that a static defensive position with 23 civilians and 3 days of food is a losing proposition within a week, regardless of the perimeter quality." Reverend Tillman, who had been listening, turned the logbook toward her. She read in silence. I stood beside her and read over her shoulder. The log was a record of received signals from multiple sources over the past 4 hours, emergency services communications, fragmented reports from ham operators, one sustained transmission from what appeared to be a National Guard unit 40 miles southeast that had used careful, coded language to describe a situation that was not being contained. The last entry in the log was 40 minutes old. It was 2 words, received at low signal strength. Moving north. She closed the logbook. "We need more range," she said to Tillman. "This radio, what's the transmission capacity?" 40 miles on a good night, less with interference." "Can you raise the guard frequency?" "I can try." He sat down at the table and began working the dial. Ethan appeared at my elbow. Marcus was with Pia near the fire. I could see them, my daughter holding Benny and standing close to this teenage boy she'd met hours ago, with the complete unself-consciousness of a child who goes where safety seems to be. "What do you need me to do?" Ethan said. "Talk to people," Mara said without looking up. "Find out who knows what." Ethan was good at this in a way I hadn't anticipated. The same quality that made him an effective teacher, the genuine interest in what other people knew, the absence of competitive listening, made him a natural at moving through a group of frightened strangers and extracting useful information without triggering defensiveness. Within 20 minutes, he'd assembled a working intelligence picture of the people at St. Augustine's, who had medical knowledge, who had relevant skills, who had vehicles with fuel, and who were running near empty, who was from where and had come by what route. There was a woman named Sandra Greer, who had worked as a trauma nurse for 18 years and had come north with her husband and her elderly mother, who had a cardiac condition requiring daily medication and a supply that would last 4 more days. There was a man named Pete Yancey, who operated a grain and feed distribution business and had a warehouse 3 miles north of Millhaven that contained, among other things, shelf-stable food in commercial quantities. There was a retired telephone infrastructure worker named Ed Colum, who took one look at the radio setup and began making modifications with tools he pulled from a bag in his truck, explaining in a flat, efficient voice what he was doing without waiting to be asked. By the time Ed finished his modifications, the radio's effective range had increased enough to pick up a clear transmission from a state emergency management frequency that hadn't been audible before. The voice on it was automated, but the content was new. Specific county designations, routing instructions for emergency personnel. And beneath those, half audible in the background of the transmission, an organic conversation between 2 people who were apparently unaware they were broadcasting, their voices tired and unguarded. We all heard it. We all went quiet. One of the voices said something about Sector 9, and then said a number, and the number was large enough that Reverend Tillman reached forward and turned up the volume without ceremony. The other voice responded with 2 words that I won't repeat here, because repeating them changes nothing and removes nothing from what they meant in that moment. In that parking lot, in the thin gray of early morning, with a fire in the drum, and 23 people standing in their coats hearing an unguarded truth that the public messaging had been carefully engineered to prevent. Dale Spender said, "That can't be right." Nobody contradicted him, because contradiction felt pointless. The number was either right or it wasn't, and the voice on the radio had no incentive to exaggerate in a private conversation it didn't know was being received. And Mara's face had not changed, which told me she had already suspected it, which told me she had known from some early hour, possibly from the whisper that had woken me at 3, that the scale of this was beyond the kind of thing that gets managed and explained and apologized for in official retrospect. Sandra Greer went quietly to her vehicle and came back with a box of medication and a blood pressure cuff and went to check on her mother. She did it without announcement, returning to the functional when the symbolic had run its course, which I recognized as its own kind of courage. Mara stepped away from the table and came to stand beside me. She leaned close, her voice pitched only for me. "We can't stay here past today," she said. Agreed. The Yancey warehouse, if it has what Ethan says. "A staging point," I said. not a permanent position. There's a community college 22 miles north of here. Agricultural campus, fenced perimeter, its own well system, large indoor spaces, maintenance infrastructure. She said it like she'd been building it for a while, assembling components in her head the way she built everything quietly, from the base up, without showing anyone the blueprint until it was load-bearing. How do you know about it? I drove mutual aid up there twice. Medical emergency at a conference. She looked at the group around the fire. It's the kind of place that could support a large group. For months, not days. The dawn was coming now, definitive and irrevocable. The sky to the east was the color of old copper, and the sun, when it finally cleared the horizon, threw long shadows from the church steeple across the gravel and across the people standing in the light, making each of them briefly enormous, and then, as the angle shifted, ordinary again. Our city behind that light was fully gone. The argument happened at 7:15 in the morning, and I want to be precise about that, because the time matters, because by 7:15 we had been awake for more than 4 hours of sustained crisis. And sustained crisis does something to the architecture of human patience that makes conflict inevitable even among people who share interests and values and a fundamental understanding of the stakes. Dale Spender did not want to leave Millhaven. He made this case with the systematic conviction of a man whose identity was structured around a particular relationship to the land he was standing on. And I understood it, even as it became clear that his reasoning had moved from strategic to emotional. He talked about the farm, his equipment, his cattle still in the fields 12 miles east. He talked about his family's 4 generations in this county. He talked about holding ground, as though ground were a concept with moral weight, independent of the people standing on it. Mara listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, "Dale, the ground isn't going anywhere. The question is whether you are." Roy Spender, the middle brother, sat down on the truck's running board and put his face in his hands. Not weeping, just done. He'd done the calculation his brother hadn't finished, and he'd arrived at a conclusion that his body was acknowledging, even if his voice couldn't yet. Carl Spender said, "Roy." Roy looked up. He looked at his brothers, and then at the people around them, and then at the road north. "Dale," he said, "we go." Dale's jaw worked. He was not a man accustomed to the sensation of being the last person to reach a conclusion in a room. He looked at the open land beyond the church, the flat farmland running away in the morning light, and something in his face did the work of setting down a weight he'd been carrying his entire life, without naming it. "Fine," he said. It came out rough and final, like something broken rather than surrendered. That was the moment I understood something about what we were all losing that had nothing to do with cities or infrastructure or the visible catastrophe unfolding at the edges of everything. People were losing the futures they'd built out of expectation, the farms, the neighborhoods, the careers and relationships and routines that had organized time into something with direction and meaning. The loss wasn't just material. It was the loss of the story a person had been telling themselves about what came next. And when that story is taken away, what's left is the raw animal question. Where do I go? And that question is terrifying in its simplicity, because it comes without the narrative scaffolding that makes decisions feel purposeful rather than merely reactive. We began organizing the convoy. Pete Yancey led us to his warehouse, which was exactly what he described, a long, low metal building set back from County Road 7, surrounded by a chain-link fence with a functional lock. Inside, the smell of dry grain and motor oil, and the particular mustiness of a space that maintains a steady temperature regardless of the season. Commercial shelving stacked with sealed pallets. a forklift, a water tank fed by a private well, a backup generator that Pete had run a maintenance check on the previous spring and had not, in the way of practical men who deal in things that actually need to work, deferred any part of that maintenance. Ethan walked the shelves with a legal pad and a pen, inventorying. Marcus helped him, the two of them moving in quiet tandem, the teenager having apparently decided that this methodical cataloging was what usefulness looked like in this moment, and was going to do it without being told. Pia sat on a low shelf with Benny and watched them, and occasionally named things she could identify, which made Pete, who was standing nearby, smile for the first time since we'd met him. Sandra's mother, whose name was June, sat in a folding chair near the entrance with a cup of instant coffee that someone had produced, and a dignity that belonged to a woman who had seen enough of the world to know that chaos was not a new phenomenon, only a recurring one, wearing different clothes. Mara and I stood at the warehouse entrance and looked at the road. "When do we move north?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "We give everyone today to rest and prepare." "And tonight?" She looked at the tree line to the east. The sound from that direction was different than it had been an hour ago. Closer, or perhaps simply more audible, now that the world had quieted enough to hear it. "Tonight," she said, "we watch. We lost 2 people before dark. Not to the infected. I want to be clear about that, because the record should be honest about all the ways a crisis takes from you, not only the obvious ones." Gerald, the gas station man from Hartwell, arrived at the warehouse just after noon, having taken us up on the church information and found the convoy instead. He arrived alone. He'd gone to Millhaven, spoken to Reverend Tillman, who was staying, his own choice made and unmovable, and followed our direction to the warehouse. He was a good addition, steady and practical and willing. The 2 we lost were a couple who had arrived in Millhaven from the city in a sedan that was running on fumes. They refueled from Pete's auxiliary supply, accepted food and water, and then in the late afternoon, while most of the group was resting, they got quietly back into their car and drove south, back toward the city. Nobody saw them leave. By the time Marcus noticed the car was gone, they were too far to raise on any frequency. They had a child in the city, a 3-year-old with a babysitter. They'd left her when Mara's call went out and had gotten 11 miles north before the magnitude of that fact outweighed everything else. I've thought about them every day since. I think about them in the way you think about a choice you weren't asked to make, but that redefines your understanding of what a choice actually is. There is a category of love that does not calculate, that does not perform a risk assessment. That simply turns around. The rest of us had to live with being people who did not turn around that evening. Sitting near the warehouse's side door on an overturned crate, I asked Mara how she had known. Not the general knowing, the intuition built from years of emergency dispatch work, but the specific, precise 3 a.m. knowing that made her get up and dress and lay her hand on my shoulder with the weight of finality. She was quiet for a long time. Not the quiet of someone who doesn't want to answer, but of someone locating an answer that hasn't been put into words before. 12 days ago, she said, I took a call from a paramedic unit in the Rosenberg district. They were describing a patient and using language I'd heard before. A specific kind of indirect description that medical personnel use when the accurate clinical term hasn't been developed yet. Like calling something a behavioral episode, because there's no established category for the behavior you're seeing. She looked at the floor. I wrote it in my personal log. I do that when something feels wrong, but I can't explain why yet. You didn't tell me. I didn't want to tell you until I understood what I was telling you. She looked up. Then 4 days ago, There was a pattern in the call volume. Not the content, just the volume. A specific kind of spike that happens in the hours before something systemic becomes visible. I've seen it twice before. Pandemic early days. The refinery incident in 2019. You've been preparing for 12 days. I started making adjustments, she said carefully. The go bag was topped up. The car's tank was kept full. I identified a northern route in case we needed one. And you didn't tell me. She met my eyes. I was afraid of being wrong, she said. And I was afraid of being right. That sentence did something to the architecture of what I thought I knew about the woman I'd been married to for 11 years. Not a revelation of deception, nothing that harsh or simple. A revelation of the weight she carried alone. The private load of professional foresight in a person who has spent a career being the last voice that holds between a crisis and its worst outcome. She'd been carrying a warning inside her for nearly 2 weeks, and she'd balanced it against the ordinary life we were living, and held it until she was sure. The sound from the east was louder now. All of us could hear it without pretending not to. Dale had organized a watch rotation without being asked, which was his native competence reasserting itself now that the argument was over. And for that I was genuinely grateful. Pia came and sat in my lap and asked me if we were going somewhere tomorrow. Yes, I said. Somewhere good. She accepted this the way children accept things from parents they trust, which is to say completely. And in that completeness, I felt the full weight of what it means to be trusted by someone whose safety depends entirely on your judgment being sound. The night was not quiet, and the watch was not without incident. At 11:40, Dale came to the warehouse interior, where most of us were arranged on improvised bedding, sleeping bags, blankets from vehicles, coats folded into pillows, and spoke in a low voice to Mara, who had not been sleeping. I'd been awake beside her. And I knew she'd been awake because her breathing never shifted into the long cadence of sleep. Though she'd been still enough that I hadn't spoken, sensing she was working through something internal that required the privacy of apparent rest. There's movement on the access road, Dale said. 3, maybe 4, moving slow. We went out together. Roy had the watch position at the fence corner with a flashlight he was keeping dark, using only to signal. The night was overcast, no moon, the kind of dark that has texture. Roy pointed toward the access road, a gravel track that connected the warehouse to County Road 7. There were 4 of them. Moving with that distinctive pattern, the directionless drift that was becoming, within our small group's shared vocabulary, the primary diagnostic. 2 were moving toward the fence. 2 had already lost interest in our direction and were angling toward the tree line to the west. Carl had a hunting rifle. Dale had the same. These were men who had grown up in fields and had an unsentimental relationship with the mechanics of what the rifle was for. They looked at Mara, not because she had claimed authority, but because over the course of the day, she had become the person in the group whose assessment of a situation people waited for before committing to action. She had not sought this. It had simply accrued to her, the way certain kinds of competence attract responsibility, whether the competent person wants it or not. She looked at the 2 moving toward the fence. She looked at their trajectory, their pace, the fence's integrity, the distance between us and them. Not tonight, she said. Sound carries. We're moving at first light, and I don't want to announce our position and our numbers and our direction to anything within 2 miles that can hear a shot. Carl lowered the rifle. Dale kept his up for another 3 seconds, then lowered it. We watched them. The 2 at the fence moved along it, found no breach, drifted south. The 2 at the tree line disappeared into the dark. We stayed at the fence for 20 minutes to confirm they'd gone. Back inside, I found Ed Colum awake with his radio equipment. He'd been quietly building an improved mobile unit all afternoon from components he'd sourced from his truck and from Pete's spare parts inventory. He handed me a headset without preamble. "Something you should hear," he said, coming from about 60 miles northwest. I listened. Through static and distance, a voice was giving coordinates and resources in the dry, organized language of logistics. It was describing a location. It was describing a population. It was describing a governance structure. Basic, functional, recent, but structured. It was describing something that had been established quickly, but with enough intention to suggest it was meant to last. "That's the agricultural college," Mara said from behind me. She'd followed me in. I looked at her. "You knew it was already active?" "I suspected," she said. "I didn't know." She took the headset, listened, handed it back to Ed. "Now I know." Ed nodded, making another notation. "They're calling it North Station," he said. "In transmissions, it's designated an S7. "Why 7? I asked. "My guess? There are at least 6 other locations transmitting on adjacent frequencies." He moved the dial slightly. A carrier signal. Another. 6 distinct sources, all within a regional range, all using similar protocol structure. "Someone was prepared," he said. "Someone built this in advance." I looked at Mara. "Don't look at me," she said. "I didn't build a radio network." "But you knew about the college." "I knew it could be used," she said. "Someone else had the same idea. Someone with resources and a longer head start." She straightened. "That's not a problem. That's the best news we've had since we left the driveway." She went to tell Dale. We left the warehouse at 5:50 the following morning. The convoy assembled and sorted with the efficiency of a group that had made exactly one significant decision together, to go and had organized everything else around that single clarifying commitment. 7 vehicles in total, our Subaru leading, then Ethan's Civic, then Dale's pickup with Roy and Carl, then Pete Yancey's delivery van loaded with supplies from the warehouse, Sandra's minivan with June and the Column couple, Gerald's truck, and Marcus driving the final vehicle, Pete's old farm truck, with a young woman named Iris, 20, who had arrived at the warehouse the previous evening with no car and no family, and had been absorbed into the group with the natural, wordless hospitality that crisis generates in decent people. The morning was gray and cold and still. The kind of morning that belongs to no season and makes no promises. We moved north on County Road 7 at a speed calibrated to keep the convoy together rather than move the lead car as fast as the road allowed. I watched the mirror constantly. Pia ate crackers from a Ziploc bag and asked questions about what we would find at the college, which I answered with careful specificity. A kitchen, she'd want to know about, and a big room for sleeping and other children probably. "Will there be a playground?" she asked. "I bet there will be," I said. "Promise?" "I hope," I said, because I decided I wasn't going to promise things I couldn't verify. She looked at me with a measuring expression that I recognized as something she'd inherited from her mother and said, "Okay, I hope too." We hit the first problem at mile 9. A tree not fallen precisely, but positioned. Someone had cut through the base of a substantial oak and guided its fall across the full width of the county road with enough precision that it blocked both lanes and the shoulder equally. The cut was recent. The wood at the stump was still light-colored, not yet weathered. Mara stopped the Subaru. Nobody else had to be told. The convoy compressed and stopped. "That's a roadblock," Dale said on the walkie. "Not debris." "Agreed," Mara said. "Hold your position." We waited. For 60 seconds, nothing moved. Then a figure appeared from the tree line to the left. One person, hands visible, moving onto the road with the body language of someone who has thought carefully about how not to look threatening. A young man, maybe mid-20s, wearing a bright orange vest over a heavy jacket, the kind of reflective vest used by road crews or hunting parties. He stopped at the fallen tree and called out. "We're not trying to hold you up," he said. "We just needed to know who was coming before you got here. There are 4 of us in the trees. We're not armed with anything significant. We came from the city 2 days ago, and we've been moving north." "Why did you block the road?" Mara called back. "Because 3 groups came through yesterday, moving north, and 1 of them was fine, and 2 of them were not fine, and we couldn't tell the difference until they were right on top of us." He paused. "We want to come with you, if that's where you're going." Mara looked at me. Then she got on the walkie. "Dale, drive the pickup forward. Let's move this tree." The young man's name was Theo. His 3 companions were a nurse's aide named Priya, an older man named Ferguson, who hadn't volunteered any professional background, but demonstrated mechanical competence immediately by helping with the tree without instruction, and a woman named Gail, who was 7 months pregnant and had been moving north for 2 days with the particular combination of necessity and determination that renders ordinary physical limitation irrelevant. We added them to the convoy. Pete's van made space. Sandra moved equipment to accommodate Gail and took her blood pressure without being asked, establishing a quiet clinical relationship in the space of 2 minutes with the professional ease of someone who has triaged in parking lots before. 11 vehicles now, counting Theo's recovered pickup. 29 people. Moving north through the gray morning in a line of vehicles that was, from above, probably visible for miles. I thought about the couple who had turned south. I thought about them the entire remaining distance. The agricultural college announced itself from 3 miles away by the smell of smoke. Not the acrid smoke of something burning that shouldn't be, but the good smoke of controlled fire. The smell of cooking and warmth that civilizations have been producing for as long as they've existed, and that the human nose identifies below the level of conscious thought as the signal of a place where people have organized themselves around survival. Pia smelled it before I did and said, "Someone's making breakfast." The campus entrance was marked by 2 vehicles parked nose to nose across the access road, manned by 4 individuals in mismatched cold weather gear carrying radios and looking alert without looking aggressive. They checked the convoy vehicle by vehicle, speaking with each driver, taking names and noting skills on a clipboard, moving with the procedural efficiency of people who had done this enough times in the past 48 hours to have developed a protocol. When they reached our car, the woman with the clipboard asked me our medical situation, our skills, and whether anyone in our vehicle needed immediate care. "My wife has 9 years emergency dispatch," I said. She looked at Mara. "We need you inside immediately," she said. "They've been trying to stand up a coordination system, and the person running it has been awake for 30 hours. The campus was a converted working farm set on about 60 acres, with a main academic building, 2 large agricultural workshops, a greenhouse range, a dormitory building, several equipment barns, and what had been a demonstration garden that was now clearly being assessed for productive expansion. There were people everywhere, organized, occupied, moving with purpose. Someone had established work rotations. Someone had mapped the well system. Someone had found and activated a short-wave transmitter array that was the source of the transmissions Ed had picked up the night before. That someone was a woman named Dr. Vaughn, who ran the agricultural science program here and had, it emerged in the following hours, spent 10 days before the city's collapse quietly converting the campus from an educational facility into a functional survival infrastructure. She had not publicized this. She had simply done it, drawing on institutional resources and professional relationships, and the particular advantage of a person who works in food production and has thought seriously about what happens when the systems that deliver food stop working. She was 58 and had the composed energy of someone who has long since made peace with being underestimated. She and Mara met in the main building's administrative corridor, both of them assessing the other with the rapid professional evaluation of two people who recognize a peer and are calculating how to be useful to each other, rather than how to establish precedents. "I need someone who can manage information flow," Dr. Vaughn said. "We have multiple incoming groups, multiple radio channels, and a coordination need that's beyond what one person can maintain." "I can do that," Mara said. "I know," Dr. Vaughn said. "The radio log from Millhaven mentioned you by name." I took Pia to the dormitory building, where a common room had been converted into a family space. There were other children. Pia saw them and looked at Benny, and then set Benny on a chair with the air of someone establishing a home base before exploring, which she then did, drifting toward the other children with the social confidence of a 7-year-old who has just completed something difficult and is ready to return to being 7. I went outside and found Ethan standing in the equipment yard, looking at the organized activity around him with the expression of a man who is revising his estimate of human nature upward after several hours of revising it in the other direction. Marcus was already somewhere in the facility. He'd been absorbed into a group of young people doing perimeter assessment within 20 minutes of arrival. "Nora's in the greenhouse," Ethan said. "She apparently has a background in horticulture that she never mentioned at any of our neighborhood barbecues." "People don't lead with their useful skills," I said. "They should." He looked at the campus, the people, the smoke rising from a cook fire near the main building. "Daniel, I think this is going to work." I didn't answer immediately. I looked at the sky, flat and gray and close. A winter sky that made no distinction between one location and another, that covered the city we'd left with the same indifference it covered this field. "It's going to try," I said. 3 weeks into North Station, we'd adopted Dr. Vaughn's designation by then. Using it without irony, the moral fracture I'd been expecting arrived. And it arrived, as these things do, not in a form that announced itself as a moral fracture, but in the form of a practical decision that revealed what kind of people we were choosing to be. A group of 11 had arrived at the campus perimeter on the 21st day. They'd come from directions that told a story before anyone said a word, east-southeast, from the city, which meant they'd been inside the affected area and had come through it. They were in variable condition. 5 were relatively functional. 3 were injured. 2 were children. And 1, a man in his 40s named Arthur, showed symptoms that Priya identified immediately and communicated to Sandra, who confirmed it and came to Mara, who came to Dr. Vaughn and me and said the thing that needed to be said quietly and precisely without making it into a larger moment than it already was. The question was put to the leadership group: Mara, Dr. Vaughn, Dale, Reverend Tillman, who had arrived 3 days after us, Sandra, and Ed, in the equipment barn, away from the general population. It was a clean question, with no clean answer. What do we do with people who may be in early transition when we have no reliable diagnostic for early transition? When the cost of being wrong in one direction is the potential exposure of 94 people, and the cost of being wrong in the other direction is the definitive abandonment of 11 human beings who have walked through a city to reach us. Dale said what Dale's instincts required him to say. Sandra provided the medical parameters she was able to provide, which were limited. Reverend Tillman said something about the parable of the lost sheep that was not pragmatically actionable, but was, in its way, an honest articulation of what it costs the soul to implement a purely protective calculus. Mara was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, she proposed a middle path that was less a compromise than a third position that reframed the question. A separate structure, the Eastern Equipment Shed, isolated but not excluded, with supplies delivered twice daily, with communication through a window, with medical monitoring at range. Not abandonment, not full inclusion. A held space in which the uncertainty could be managed across the 72 hours that Sandra said was the relevant window. The 5 functional members of the group, when this was explained to them through the perimeter by Mara herself, accepted it. 2 of them wept. The man named Arthur, who understood why he specifically was the subject of the arrangement, said nothing for a moment, then said, "I would do the same." For 72 hours, he stayed in the shed. He spoke through the window with anyone who came. He read from a paperback thriller that someone had left in the shed from before. He slept. He ate. His symptoms did not progress. On the morning of the 73rd hour, Sandra and Priya conducted the closest thing to a clinical assessment their resources allowed, and the group held a brief, honest conversation. And Arthur joined the community. He became, within a week, one of its most essential members, a former logistics manager who applied his professional knowledge to the supply chain problems that Dr. Vaughn had identified as the campus's medium-term vulnerability. He worked 18-hour days with the particular urgency of someone who understood, without discussing it, that he was working against a debt that couldn't be paid in any other currency than usefulness. That decision, the one Mara had made in the barn, became the foundation of how North Station handled every subsequent hard case. Not a rule exactly, but a posture. A willingness to hold uncertainty without resolving it prematurely in either direction. To stay in the discomfort of the not yet known, while maintaining both the safety of the many and the dignity of the individual. It cost something every time. It was never clean. It never produced certainty. But it produced over time something more durable than certainty. It produced trust, the only infrastructure that doesn't require a generator and doesn't run on fuel and can't be blockaded by a fallen tree across a county road. I watched it being built, one hard decision at a time, and I understood that this was what survival actually looked like when you stripped away everything that survival stories usually dress it in. I'm recording this from the dormitory building at North Station, 4 months after the night Mara woke me at 3 in the morning. It's early evening. Through the window I can see the greenhouse lights. We've extended the growing season with supplemental lighting. Dr. Vaughn's system, part of an expansion that has added 3 times the original productive capacity. There are 147 people here now. Pia found a playground. Someone built one behind the main building from equipment salvaged from a county park. She goes there every afternoon with a rotating group of children whose names I now know as well as my own, and I watch her sometimes from the window and feel something that I can't call happiness exactly. It's too aware of its own fragility for that, but that sits in the same neighborhood as gratitude, when gratitude is honest about what it cost. Mara runs communications. She is, by universal recognition, the reason the information architecture of this place functions. She comes to bed late and wakes early and carries the weight of knowing things that others don't yet, and manages that weight with the same quiet discipline she's always brought to everything she's ever been asked to carry. I don't know how she does it. I have told her that I don't know how she does it. She said she doesn't know either, and that not knowing is fine, because the doing doesn't require the knowing. She was right about leaving. She was right about everything. I'm beginning to understand that some people simply hear the world more honestly than the rest of us. We listen to them or we don't. We got lucky. We listened.